If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle.
Hello, all. I think that this quote is pretty self-explanatory, to be honest. But what it doesn't explain is how the metaphorical and literal knowledge of oneself and one's enemy can be achieved, merely that it is desirable to know both, to exist within a state of information dominance. Webster's English Dictionary defines information dominance as... Okay, Webster's doesn't have an entry for infodom, so we're really diving into this without a parachute. So to use up our precious remaining moments before impact, let's start with a quick recap as we rapidly accelerate to the ground. In Part 1, we learned information dominance is the control of the information landscape to the exclusion of other powers. Think of how air supremacy works. And this is desirable because control of the information landscape lets you control the enemy's decision-making process. To this end, there are a bunch of individual strategies and tactics used to achieve information dominance. The most notable for our purposes are psychological operations, the emphasis of selected truths, which are used in concert with military deception, the use of strategically valuable lies, in order to convince an opponent to make bad, wrong, or predictable choices. In the first half of Part 2, we demonstrated that the American right wing, including those who materially aid them, regardless of their ideology, use and participate in a consistent strategy of information dominance. In the second half, we learned that the right wing finds and gives funding and attention to people based on their non-reactionary identities so long as they support and repeat right-wing talking points. In both parts, we saw that this kind of self-directed propaganda started before these strategies were codified, but kicked into high gear after World War II once they had been formalized in the war. They have directly led to the erasure of leftist ideology from American political discourse and the deaths of millions through the various eugenic and militaristic policies which were carried out with the support from a massive propaganda machine. If you're here, it means you have a high tolerance for propaganda and are looking for more powerful explanations for how the world works. This essay is about a methodological process which will help you unpack and examine how reactionary ideology is injected into the discourse. So, having covered what information ops generally are, and having gone over how they're used even in civilian life by the reactionary machine, we see examples of this everywhere. I have like 300 pages of just endless historical bookkeeping of all the horrors supported by right-wing information dominance, from the Iran-Contra affair to using the self-defense of the Iraqi people as a continuing excuse to crush them. If we just take the material outcomes of the ideological propaganda war between the right and the left is clearly the better team. The left wants to stop the climate apocalypse, the right wing believes that the climate apocalypse is an unavoidable side effect that will cause regrettable market disruptions. The left wing wants to expand worker rights and benefits, the right wing wants to strip them. I knew going into essaying that being correct about economics and ecology is not necessarily enough. When a person is passingly familiar with leftist arguments, even if they resonate with the goals of leftist society, there's always questions and concerns about the extent to which the left has historically succeeded in its goals and how it's failed. We aren't considering those today. If you want to see me address some of those claims, I have another essay about it here. Content warning for pomegranate crimes. This confusion is a symptom which helps us understand the nature and extent of successful leftist history, but the confusion is made worse by a classic strategy employed by the right wing since at least Hitler. Just pretend to be a leftist. Simply using our rhetorical style and language makes it easy to prey on the very sympathies someone might hold. Brand yourself as part of the common people, though you have no intent to be. When Hitler gets any power, he renames the German Workers' Party to be the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, so that he could attract people with leftist but especially anti-establishment sympathies to hear his crackpot anti-Semitism. The ability and habit of right-wing institutions to pretend to be leftist was written about by ancient philosopher and playwright Gira Cardioliantos, or as he's commonly referred, J. Regulus, in his magnum opus Council of Wacky Ideologies. He says this.
Hello? I am back from centrist meeting. Lil Nazbo. You finally decided to come.
Yes, I was trying to decide, am I centrist or am I wacky? And I have decided I am neither. I am regular extremist.
A wacky extremist, though, right? You're with us.
Huh? Oh no, I am not wacky ideology. I am regular ideology. I make sense.
Nazbol, everybody think you joke. Even I think you joke, and my defining characteristic, comically large dinosaur bone.
Then go on. Think I'm a joke. But the truth is, left-wing economic policy is completely compatible with right-wing cultural policy. So laugh. The truth is, you will not discover that I am a danger until it is too late.
That scene made me literally unsub from his channel because it was a little too real and scary for a silly Political Compass memes channel. And if and when Dontron leaves, then the authoritarian right is going to try to weasel its way into power through the other most common infiltration mechanisms: electoralism, recruitment, and entryism. We just spent a year straight talking about electoralism, so I'm going to skip it. And we see them trying to recruit by holding meetings and marches, and it's pretty straightforward, so it's entryism that I'm concerned with. Someone pretending to be straddling the left and right until the next Red Terror. The authoritarian left, or auth-left, and Nazbols or National Bolsheviks and Strasserites will always eat that shit up, until they're choking on blood like they did in Iraq, Syria, Argentina, Chile, and Spain, and Ukraine, Germany 2 distinct times, etc. So, our goal with this essay is to give us the tools not just to examine how the right wing makes appeals to the general population as we did in parts 1 and 2, but to engage with the tools to dissect propaganda. More generally, we'll take apart ideas in order to see what makes them tick, and talk about how to make decisions that best respond to the information. For no particular reason that I can come up with, Among Us will be playing in the background of this, a video about modern strategic uses of truth and lies. Part 1. Balaclavas and Other Social Niceties. Developed by the United States military strategist John Boyd, the OODA loop is a system designed to be so simple that a 17-and-a-half-year-old boy can figure it out, and so broad in its applicability that a general can make a decision about which of his troops are going to get shafted. Or, so a soldier can make decisions even when traumatized by the deaths of all of your squad mates when 5,000 miles from home in some godforsaken foxhole. Grim! OODA loop is actually a very purposeful name. It contains both an acronym for the order of operations and an explanation of the basic procedural methods, the observe, orient, decide, and act loop. Incidentally, this contains one of the most interesting things about military philosophy, the divorce between decision and action, which places the thoughtful military strategy at odds with the fascistic cult of mindless action. But that's a rumination for another day. Today, we're going to be talking about what these 4 OODA operators mean in the context of information dominance analysis. Thankfully, these are simple words that you already know, so let's dive right in. Observe. Take a moment and put your attention on what is in front of you. You have come into contact with a piece of media, or an idea, or a real-life situation, and you collect information. To cohesively show the methodology, we'll be focusing on a single piece of media and see how to look at and evaluate a text, something everyone can agree deserves critique. Ready or not, you're now seeing Lubenschluben, and it was just a short 90-second video of Hitler overseeing a fun little winter sports competition between SS officers and just being a normal happy-go-lucky amphetamine addict. First, you probably made some observations about the subject and activity of the clip and automatically filled in some context before I said anything. I will now fill out the context more fully as a piece of media than Joe Elias the Great did when he invented it. You can first observe that British Pathé shared Lubenschluben on Twitter for educational purposes and very few people interacted with it. You can look up the movie and find out it was made in 1939. That it was produced and directed by Leni Riefenstahl, and that they wanted to make a whole film with the express purpose of making Hitler look like a fun dude. They were foiled only by the self-induced pressure of their genocidal project, which meant they could only get him for one afternoon in the snow. You can discover that it ran in front of every showing in a German theater from 1940 until, due to a clerical oversight, 2 months after the man killed himself. In this case, because you're very determined to figure out what all this nonsense is, you look in the primary source documents and see that the public opinion of Hitler improved after this video came out. That's a lot of information to observe, and it draws a more complete picture of Lubenschluben and the situation in which you've encountered it. Who would broadcast it? Who are they trying to reach? What are they trying to say? Why are they saying it? How are they saying it? In what context is it being discussed and brought up? When you're dealing with an idea, the context of this idea is almost always as important as its contents. The step of going out of your way to observe more about the idea is a vital one, and the central battlefield of information dominance. If you have a better understanding of the situation than your opponent, you can use that leverage to limit the information they have access to and therefore their available options. Think back to that Sun Tzu quote from the beginning. Even merely understanding the information landscape can be tricky, especially when under pressure. Sometimes all you can tell is that a sniper has you pinned down from a direction with an elevated position. Actually, the state of the information landscape does often overlap with the physical landscape. Anyway, as you're taking in these external observations, you must orient, which is a weird way to say double-check the observations in their objective form against your vast internal ecosystem of facts and feelings, and determine what it means from your point of view and for your purposes. It's important to note that most, if not all, forms of analysis and critique can and often should be employed. Critical race theory, intersectionality, material analysis, and more. Even if you try to use the OODA loop in a vacuum, nature despises a vacuum. In a vacuum, Lubenschluben could be viewed harmlessly, but as you observe the metadata and think about Hitler's place in the Nazi project and what improving Hitler's public image means, you orient yourself to the observations based on that frame of reference. Very simple. Lubenschluben was a work designed to maintain a larger persona of Hitler, a persona which was a lie, a piece of propaganda for the Nazis, you might say. And speaking of Nazi propagandas and falsities, my orientation brings me to Joseph Goebbels' famous quote about the big lie.
Meh. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can only be maintained for such a time as the state can avoid the political, economic, and military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Yeah.
So, we can say the act of creating the video used in Lubenschluben was part of the state's mechanism for self-preservation through maintaining a certain image of the head of state. So, these 3 points are a sample orientation, a direct statement about its purpose, a quote by a figure relevant to the ideology and media in question, and an extrapolation based on the other orientations. So yeah, we've observed Lubenschluben and oriented ourselves to it. More like Mühlenschluben, am I right? Now we've got to take this to the next level. Let's make a capital D decision. To figure out what kind of decision you can even make, first you have to ask yourself what kind of objective you have and how that objective is affected by the information we're considering. As a leftist, I have 3 distinct objectives: disrupt reactionary plans, make sick burns on Twitter, and to create a society which respects the existence and processes of life. So what can we do here that supports any of those objectives? Well, we could quote, retweet, and punch up at Hitler a bit. We could comment and link it in a Discord server and spread the fun facts we learned to help inform people of the process of manufacturing consent. We could call a General Assembly of the 420th International to discuss the looming threat of the Third Reich. Or more likely, we just decide to leave it and keep scrolling. I'm sure that the action you'd like to take flashed through your mind, more than one action, in fact, or different versions of the actions that I listed. If you thought about them, then you'd be able to think of the pros and cons of each, and feed your observations about your own decision process back into the OODA loop to be considered as well. This is an important point. Our orientation is informed by this procedural fractal of possible actions. Information dominance attempts to affect our orientation, and in turn our decision process by manipulating the information landscape to obscure possible actions. In this case, because Lubenschluben is designed as a puff piece for a dead Nazi not currently involved in the Nazi business and not widely being shared or shown to people, the best option to me seems just like moving on, right? It's important while teaching the OODA loop that we take note, which is to say that we observe our own orientation and decision processes and the result of our action, and adjust course from there. For example, if a bunch of fish dads were sharing Lubenschluben and saying they'd like to have a beer with Hitler and talk him out of that whole Holocaust nonsense, well, that's a different scenario. If our internal processes wind up with us acting, it is important to take note of why we are choosing to act in one situation, but might not in another. Not only that, but when we set up our decision space, it's also critical to analyze and orient the space as well, because you may find yourself acting in a manner skewed away from effective strategies. If you're pinned by a sniper and you make the decision to run for it, maybe feed that decision back into the old OODA loop and see if getting shot by a sniper was really your best option. The OODA loop demands a near dual consciousness to observe your own decision-making process, which is kind of a huge pain to develop and maintain. Note-taking and journaling is an effective method to keep track of your own orientation and to observe changes in your thoughts and behavior. But there are many methods. The pros and cons list, the counsel, the talking to someone who hasn't had a chance to respond for just long enough to realize you knew the right answer anyway, and much more. Finally, once the decision process is finished, we act. The actions taken through this decision-making process are broadly applicable. If it was shared by somebody you don't know on a Discord server you thought was Nazi-free, this will orient differently and therefore affect the decision space differently than if a respectable historiographic institution shares it on Twitter, or if it was sent to you in DMs during an internet Nazi tantrum. Action isn't a long step, but again, every step of this process gets fed back into the OODA loop, so the way that our actions change the situation should be clearly and carefully considered in a way that will allow us to reorient ourselves to the more effective decisions and to not be afraid to change course if our methodology is sound or unsound.
The sunk cost fallacy and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. Yeah.
So, we've analyzed the situation, we've read Lubenschluben's Wikipedia page, did a Google Translate on some primary source documents, we've oriented ourselves to the information available that Lubenschluben was on Twitter and historical contents, and have elegantly balleted our way to a decision to move on from Lubenschluben, which sleds gently down the Twitter memory hole. I might say, what an easy choice to make. But in this exercise, we found out so much more by partaking than simply the decision to move on. You found out about the use of puff pieces to recuperate the image of people who both depend on the hierarchy and benefit it greatly. You were able to discern, or at least narrow down, the likely reasons that the opposing actor posted literal Hitler apologia into your feed, and you were able to examine your own biases and hopefully work around them. But what if the situation is a little less cut and dry than Hitler apologia? Part 2, more like oops loop, because oops. So what happens when you get an idea that's good or even great, but you find while observing and orienting yourself to this broadly applicable and novel concept that it was created in a way that you might say is casually or even professionally eugenic, to select a wildly random example that won't immediately loop back onto itself? Well, John Boyd, you may remember him from a couple pages ago, where he codified the OODA loop. Well, he considered genetic heritage to be part of the orientation process in his original vision for the OODA loop. That doesn't sound good. It makes it sound like he thinks that your bloodline has something to do with how you think about the world, to be honest. And yeah, I know it's the job of every leftist to drown the baby in the bathwater before disposing of both, so it seems like I just taught y'all a big load of steer shit. But what if we can sort of observe, orient, and decide to act in a way that isn't shitty even when we are using processes which maybe were designed by people who were definitely shitty? For example, your neurotype is something that will affect your orientation and it's not on there, and your genetic heritage will only affect it insofar as your cultural tradition ascribes significance to it, so we can keep culture and drop the weirdly eugenic genetic heritage from the observation star and make it neurotype conscious as well by adding in neurotype. But even better than that, the OODA loop is essentially the scientific process adapted to the operational planning space. You observe, you draw conclusions, make hypotheses, test them, all the while feeding it back onto itself in order to weed out biases and make actionable claims about the world. So it's absolutely vital that we eschew reactionary pseudoscience from our decision-making processes. In the modern military, they constantly crow about how diversity is good despite all their killing of black and brown people. And one of the ways they do this is by bringing up the fact that everyone's skill set, their background, their cultural and religious traditions, and every single experience they've had can be relevant to solving a problem, so we can't afford to be discriminatory in a live-fire environment. So maybe we've made this idea more palatable for you, because the process does have broad applicability, and its shitty origins should be acknowledged and dunked on, and furthermore disentangled from the rest of it and discarded. But there are other subjects which are much less procedural and therefore much harder to do this with. Part 3. Nosballs? More like Deesballs. For this segment, we'll have a Tucker Carlson interview playing in the background for no particular reason. So, Stalinists, Nosballs, Red Browns, Strasserists, National Socialists. At first inception, it's kind of difficult to pull apart where an authoritarian tendency that abuses socialist or leftist language starts, and leftists who have an authoritarian streak ends. Not least because of the historical evidence, such as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Strasserist involvement in the Nazi rise to power, Argentina's Guerra Sucia, and so on. Each time we see reactionary leaders adopt leftist language to explain why this violent reactionary plan must be put up with or aided before stabbing their leftist component in the back. This reactionary tendency is exactly the position that Nosballs adopt, claiming to be a middle ground between the authoritarian tendency of Soviet-style socialism. No. This reactionary tendency is exactly the position that Nosballs adopt, claiming to be a middle ground between the authoritarian tendency of Soviet-style socialism and Nazi-style capitalism, which is to say, an agreement between a pair of World War II aesthetic authoritarians. In its current incarnation, the Nosballs reinvented themselves after the fall of the Soviet Union, when reactionary malcontents still hated liberalism but were also disillusioned with socialism. This is an important point when thinking about red-brown ideologies, so-called because red is red like communism and brown is brown shirts like Hitler's Sturmabteilung gang. The point being that authoritarian hierarchy, because it is the only thing the two tendencies agree on, is going to suck the air out of the room for any socialist progress, so we'll just continue forward with our capitalist hellscape under any red-brown plan. The only difference is a bogus layer of a secret police that can kick down your door the second you disagree, or when someone snitches on your subversive activities, like shopping for your neighbors or participating in a soup kitchen. And that's a yikes from me, dog. But the conceptual red-browns who are visibly and definitely there, like noted ghouls Caleb Mopin, Tucker Carlos, and Amy Teresa, aren't really the problem at first. They're the daily stormer of ideology, the place you go when you're looking at the ideas seriously, critically, or credulously. No, the problem comes from the organizations that are not openly nationalist or authoritarian, groups who use a cloak of credibility to make their shit appear benign or even reasonable. We need to look out for our very own dapper white nationalist in a suit, coming to preach to us about the danger of empire and how the only solution is to join a vanguard party and rule or submit or lie down and rot, or any other solution that convinces us to relinquish our power to systems which would, and do, abuse us. So let's look at Angela Nagle for a moment. Her claim to fame is a book called Kill All Normies, in which she reports on Gamergate and the rise of the alt-right. She accepts that Nazis are bad, but then also accepts the words those Nazis wrote about scary SJWs at face value, and blames Tumblr for the rise of Donald Trump. This is a generalization of the book, but if you're wondering about that time period, read Neo-Reaction, A Basilisk by Elizabeth Sandifer instead. It's so much better. But what I want to do is use the OODA loop from my orientation to examine an article of Nagle's. The left case against open borders is an argument made by Angela Nagle in 2018, in which she lays down some claims about the concept of borders which we'll go over here. She sets the stage by bringing up Reagan. In the same style of rhetoric that he demanded the Soviets tear down the Berlin Wall, he also carved out trade unions and made legal millions of immigrants. I note that American policy has alternated between making immigrants legal and illegal every few decades or so since the Mexican-American War based off the need of capitalists for cheap labor. And here we run into our first problem. In the first paragraph, she's setting up the conceptual point that the immigrants have something to do with weakening the power of the left by substituting American unions for the left. Notwithstanding that the American left had not had real union power since Taft-Hartley made leftist union activities functionally illegal, and trade unions aren't fundamentally leftist, they're collective bargaining bodies for workers, which is leftist compatible, a necessary distinction. If you've got a problem with this framing of unions, I urge you to suggest to a POC that white-only unions are a valid form of leftist organizing. If you got a hankering for hands that can't be satisfied, I mean. Okay, continuing. Angela Nagel segues into the anti-globalization movement and Occupy, and oh boy, the Occupy understander has logged on. She says a lack of bargaining power means that Occupy fizzled out and accomplished nothing, besides a foot in the door for leftist philosophy to millions of Americans, which is just admitted, and the protest movements consistently force a change across history or lead to rebellions, which is just admitted, or the fact that every organized movement has faced police repression since they started, which is just admitted. What I'm doing, as you can see, is observing the article and orienting those observations based on my knowledge and experience as I pass through it. Because the OODA loop is a continuous process, you should be engaging your orientation for each observation, and so they're showing up as simultaneous in this live-fire scenario demonstration. She segues into the claim that because Trump is hardline anti-immigration, that liberals would position themselves as open border, both poisoning the well by conflating liberal and leftist, and ignoring that anarchists have been open borders since we realized immigration controls are a legal mechanism to prevent workplace organization. Indeed, Nagel goes on to mention the selfsame UFW strike that led to our current system, which can be summarized as open immigration, but you get beat up by the cops if you immigrate without money and get deported for unionizing whether or not you have money. After that whole slog, she slides haphazardly into the leftist point, no human is illegal, and makes the false claim that this philosophical point is contrary to the idea of a sovereign nation, and whereas it definitely is a call to prevent sovereign nations from determining who is allowed to be inside their borders, it isn't a strict repudiation, so she's doing whatever the opposite of a Mott and Bailey is. Straw cavalry? I don't know, metaphors are hard. Anyway, more poisoning the well as she says that Bernie is pro-border control, considers open borders to be a Koch brothers plan, which is a very orthodox Marxist way to look at that, despite Marxism and materialism being very much able to demonstrate that having a second-class human category in your nation isn't a great place to start at for movements, and isn't great for building solidarity among the oppressed in various classes. The next section is entitled Useful Idiots, positioning the reader, who she believes is ensnared in the selected truths she's shit out, above open border leftists. This portion culminates as she draws a false equivalency between her anti-immigrant stance and Marx. She repeats Marx when he points out that the English ruling class stoke racial tensions between English workers and Irish immigrant workers, but Britain was able to create a far more powerful workers' party than America ever saw, and Russia had like 20 unique ethnicities when the February Revolution kicked off. This is clearly a failure to consider on her part, or purposefully elided. The section ends with a call to abolish the economic circumstances that lead to migration in the first place. This is plainly an orthodox Marxist adaptation of the opiate of the masses logic. Communism doesn't seek to destroy religion, but to destroy the conditions which make religion desirable. This segues neatly into the section, The Human Cost of Globalization, in which she talks about NAFTA, a famous 1994 free trade agreement you may or may not have heard of. She waffles about this for a bit while ignoring the millions of immigrants who were legalized by Reagan in her intro 8 years prior. Also, shit, imagine playing a fancy shell game about the economic imperialism of NAFTA without bringing up the Zapatista movement. This might be because she has no way to incorporate the EZLN and Chiapas Autonomous Region into her theory. Babytown. She crawls into the next section, corporate interests and moral blackmail, by claiming that our empathy is being hijacked by liberals for a Kochian agenda. She says some snarky shit like, you think you're doing a country a favor by taking its PhD havers, but the PhD guys are coming through official programs, meaning the state of opened or controlled borders aren't at issue there, are they? She closes this section by calling mass migration a tragedy, and, assuming post-NAFTA only, she's well supported by what she has included in the text. Real A- work. The next portion, defending immigrants, opposing systemic exploitation, she says that open borders thing is a Cato Institute and Milton Friedman thing, and we have to focus on protecting immigrants while preventing the economic devastation that brought them. The main thrust of her solution, which she claims is to protect immigrants from exploitation, and which doesn't follow from the premises she's set forth, and the reason I decided to include her, is that she thinks we should expand the use of E-Verify. You know, the Department of Homeland Security's immigrant tracking system, mandated by Clinton, brainchild of Bush, expanded by Obama. Let me try again. Her solution is to mandate that employers check the immigration status on all employees in order to protect immigrants, right? Last shot. Her solution, the point that leftists should organize around, is keep the same you can cross the border whenever but good luck ever seeing your kids again system we have now, but give the power to enforce it directly to the bosses whom Marxists should implicitly distrust. Okay, great leftist analysis, Dr. Nagel. Next time you'll be telling us veganism just helps big soy and has no philosophical relation to eco-socialism. Speaking of eco-socialism, there's a point she never brought up, that climate change is going to force mass migration, tragedy or not, and we have to push for a society that honors life and not some kind of compassionate conservatism, multi-level regime between native sons and indentured field boys. And even just that would be kind of a nitpick, but she mentions the Koch brothers, the inheritors of the Nazi profiteering oil baron, and some of the largest proponents of climate denial. So there's a constant feeling that when she mentions the Koch brothers, the Cato Institute, and the rest of the lib-right funky bunch that comes up when you're reading her book, Kill All Normies. This feeling is that she's far too willing to take the right wing's word at what they want. If the billionaires wanted open borders, we would have open borders. So her claiming they do falls flat to me. Hell, even her argumentation falls into the Cold War trap of describing the world using doctrinal language, all the way to literally parroting the right-wing framing of this very subject as mass migration, a focus group-tested scary phrase, instead of just travel or work arrangements. Most immigration is on a temporary basis anyway, and most undocumented immigrants entered legally and let their documents lapse, a paperwork error. Okay, that was us observing the article and expounding the orientation. It is, in the truest sense, a psyop. The article uses selected truths to imply a state of affairs which supports the creator's desired information landscape. Really, most persuasive media are psyops. For example, this fucking essay is a psyop. You can't stop me because you're a psyop too! Where was I? Oh, yeah. So, we've determined our orientation. Angela Nagel misrepresents the facts by focusing on a tertiary line, the post-NAFTA effects of the free movement of capital, and analogizing both legalized and traditional immigration as net negatives for the working class, despite the fact that it doesn't follow statistically, historically, or philosophically. Her analysis, despite parroting Marxist framings, exists wholly within the neoliberal paradigm, instead of analyzing how our capitalist hell world and a world beyond capitalism can be bridged. And in doing so, her analysis is fatally flawed as a leftist text. She exhibits an over-reliance on the concept of nations to save us, and tries to argue for nationalism because Marx said that English communists should call for Irish independence. But there's more to observe on the Angela Nagel front. Atassa Araxia Abrahamian's rebuttal of Nagel is strong, link in the nether, and much more detailed than mine because mine is an exercise to determine how to use the OODA loop to see if an ideology of a supposed leftist is red-brown compliant. In that rebuttal, Abrahamian claims that, quote, but in the same way that Nagel's critique of open borders does not necessarily mean she shares motives with ethno-nationalists, and Tucker Carlson appearance notwithstanding, I think it's safe to assume she does not. A left open border policy does not necessarily follow from or aid the interests of corporations or neoliberal economists, and continues later, given that she's an expert on internet trolls, not migration. Only, she's not really an expert on internet trolls. Yeah, she's a person who cataloged their activity, but she reported it pretty uncritically, or even credulously if you want to be uncharitable. When, in her conclusion, Nagel says only a strong national left in the small and developing nations, acting in concert with a left committed to ending financialization and global labor exploitation in larger countries, could have any hope of addressing these problems, you'll notice she invokes a left committed while talking about international solidarity. She is describing an international left made of national lefts, if you will. Did you catch it? She is describing socialism in the terms of nationalism. So, whether intentionally or not, Angela Nagel is advocating for a National Socialist platform, which maps her position with regards to E-Verify, migration, and the left more clearly than when she described herself as a leftist while disagreeing with every single goddamn thing that other leftists do. And my confidence in my orientation, which claims her writings support red-brown ideology, is based not on some weird Pepe Sylvia, but from her writing, both Kill All Normies and this article. Just like red-brown ideology generally, which vacuums air out of the room for leftists who have interesting things to say, and fills it with whitewashed authoritarian propaganda. It's sad that I only have these two examples, though, because I still can't conclusively prove that maybe she's a little too comfortable with Nazis, or that she would use the comfortableness to publicly jam a culture creed crowbar where it didn't belong. I'm pretty confident, but if only there was more— oh wait. She runs apologia for the class reductionism crowd? And exclaims in far, far, far more words than this that her political tendency is the only valid ones and everyone who has a different tendency is simply rogue and bad wrong? Cool, okay. Okay, you know, I'll help Angela Nagel out with this one. Follow my logic. If your favorite statue haver was a guy who died doing Nazi black ops on a Nazi U-boat, helping deliver a Nazi spy behind Allied lines, maybe the plaque on his statue needs an asterisk, because the Nazi thing is asterisk-worthy if you ask me. Even if he was working with the IRA too, you know, just the Nazi thing, you know, maybe it deserves a little notarino. Okay, continuing with the orientation, I need to make an aside. The reason why a red-brown alliance is even hypothetically possible is because of so much of authoritarian leftist ideology can be boiled down to, yeah, I want a cool communist future, but I can't think of a way to force those fucking liberals to accept my ideology without the state. So we need to hijack the current state or create a new one to accomplish this, which is usually nationalist. This leaves them open to a handshake arrangement with ultranationalists, where they adopt red-brown ideology. And that is what this form of ideology fundamentally is. You get, hey, we both want to be in charge of the state and hate liberalism, why don't we work together to get it, then settle our beef afterwards? The actually National Bolshevik point about the compatibility of right and left authoritarians is literally the same strategy as the Nazis, literally the same one. And that ended with the Night of the Long Knives, a political betrayal that rooted out the leftist elements of the Nazi Party. But it's not just the Nazis. State-reliant ideology is weak to it. Look at Gonzalo and Sendero Luminoso in Peru. Look at Iraq and Syria under the Ba'ath Party, and every other example of lefty groups with authoritarian leanings. The only way to prevent this is to make sure the people who would be the victims of these states are, instead, the controllers of their future. And here is where I make it a bit more personal. I might be trans, but I'm still male passing. So I could easily just melt away and ride out a Nazbol regime, so I'm not saying this for my fucking health. No, what I'm saying, since Angela Nagel seems so keen to leave it out, is that INS, CBP, or ICE do their migrant raids against brown people, which historically includes Native Americans who happened to have been born in the part of the United States that was stolen from Mexico. Millions of people have been chased down, kidnapped, and deported from their ancestral homes. I'll repeat it so it sticks. They had to illegally cross the border to return to their ancestral homes. Many of these people and their descendants had to or have to live without papers because the state eliminated their citizenship on purpose to reduce the preponderance of brown people in those territories. Don't want them getting legislators, do we? But again, that's a conversation for another day. These indigenous people and migrants and people who speak Creole, Pidgin, Patois, and other dialects, and every other type of person get harassed, not just by La Migra, but by the state for merely existing. It's clear that to participate in our society, they can't hide the way that I can, and even more so if every employment vacancy is a one-way ticket to a foreign land like E-Verify universality would cause. And with this orientation and our dry run of using the OODA loop, we can see that our desire to create a better world must lead to the decision process here. And what decision space can exist within my means with our orientation? I have no gulag in which to re-educate her, no firing squad to put her up against the wall for her nationalist heresy. Nor do I want them. I can't meaningfully converse with her or change her views or exile her from my community. It seems the best thing I can do in this case is use her as an example as a scary nationalist streak within lefty spaces, and because we've been talking about the subject so specifically, to disavow anyone who is willing to empower the state, or whose purposes include enhancing borders or stripping or restricting the rights of any person or people. And the action based on that decision is communicated here in conclusion to the 3-part series. With history as our guide, we can construct a maxim that uses the thesis of this information dominance series. We can have a civilization without a state, but if we have a state, we will slowly but surely lose everything that makes life worth living, if not our lives. And without continuous analysis of our information landscape, we'll travel from fight to fight, from disaster to disaster, from defeat to defeat, and never see the happy ending in the final chapter of our own books. Because right now, the right dominates our stories. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, the best thing you can do is share it out on Twitter and Discord and whatever, and subscribe and comment and all that stuff. Big thanks to our patrons over at Patreon, listed here, especially our ogres, Jacob Kleefkes, Kevin Young, Nick Schvert, Thomas Wolfskeller, and The Nick of Time. And Wuku, our Grandpa tier patron. If you like the Ogres and Gremlins, you can check out our resident artist on Twitter at Gremlins Online, or furiously writing articles about the related topic on Sasquatch, the Sasquatchian-based Sasquatch watch site. If you love the music, you can find Brent Entrican on Twitter or at school, really too busy to experiment with drugs if we're going to be honest. Thanks to Poppycock for doing the subtitles, and extra special thanks to Fox C for doing a copy edit, and to Twin Rabbits and Malaise for donating voices. You can find them on Twitter, all links in the nether. Taking a moment here at the end to hop back to that Joseph Goebbels quote, as voiced by Malaise, all links are in the nether. Goebbels is 90% correct in that quote, but makes a fundamental misstep. Each of the videos in my Information Dominance series has shown how selected truths and strategically valuable lies are used by the state, and those who want to harness it in order to push their own ends. And we just saw the report where the state wasted millions of dollars trying to surveil Portland activists only to drown in a terabytes-deep ocean of cancellations. We have nothing to hide, but the state has various state secrecy acts, which make it a crime to reveal certain selected truths that the government wants hidden, or to debunk their strategically valuable lies using information they have mandated into secrecy. It's not so much that the truth is the enemy of the state, since truth is another tool in their belt, so much as honesty is the enemy of the state, since we're being honest about which truths they're withholding or which lies they're propagating would be antithetical to the reproduction and expansion of state powers, or they wouldn't have criminalized it. Hey, thanks for sticking to the end.